Uh, it's kind of hard to believe that we're coming to the end already. It feels like we just started in a way we did, but it's also just the beginning for all of you because you're about to join us on campus and we're all really, really excited about that. I'm not going to hold you any longer listening to me because I want you to get to the main event, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Hasselbach to begin her presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I've been doing this series for a few years now, and I've been lucky enough to be on panels with both Dr. Asaro and Dr. Vickers before, and I'm just really excited to be a student as well today. So thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. Let me just share my screen and then I will. So thank you so much for having me here. My name is Professor Hasselbach. I teach in the English department. I am also the director of the Writing Center, which I hope you will check out. As you know, so you read this E.M. Forster story, this science fiction story that I asked you to read. So we are going to talk about nature and humanity as Forster uncovers them in this story through the lens of this kind of disconnection from it and this overuse of over-reliance on technology. So I have just these quotes. We'll go into greater depth into these quotes later, but night and day, wind and storm, tide and earthquake, impeded man no longer. So this sense of feeling like nature is something that is impeding you, that's stopping humans from doing something, from achieving something. He had harnessed Leviathan. So this sense of a power struggle, this quote from mythology, from the Hebrew Bible, right? This monster that must be tamed. And then here, all the old literature with its praise of nature and its fear of nature rang false as the prattle of a child. So this sense of dismissing nature as this insignificant thing that must be conquered, that must be harnessed, that's inconsequential to us and our lives. And we learn in the story that's very much not the case. So we will delve into this and some other quotes specifically about the engagement that Forster causes with nature in the story. Before that, I just want to go into a couple of things about, why we study literature, what you'll get from your humanities classes at USD. I know you have to take core classes. I had to do that too. I'm really grateful. I had to take physics. I'm really grateful for that. But so maybe just a greater sense of why that is and how to kind of enter that sphere with an open mind if it's not something that you would have elected to take on your own. So we'll start with that. Then I'll go into a bit more detail about Forster, the author, and about the text itself. We will get into some of his world building in this story and then into the nature scenes and talk about what that disconnection means for this society, and then some kind of takeaways and further reading at the end. So okay, diving in. So what is gained by studying literature? I will just go through this quickly. This is not why we're here, right? But I have some quotes because I love quotes. These are authors talking about reading and writing, but just a few reasons why we do this, right? So politics, religion, philosophy, they live in language and discourse. You absolutely have to comprehend that language, that discourse, in order to be a functional member of a society, right? You want to be engaged, you want to be informed. You need to be able to read sensitively and understand things, right? Reading stories told from different perspectives can help us to understand the varied experiences that constitute our community and our world. So to get kind of out of yourself, out of your own sphere and enter someone else's mind and experience, that's really important to understanding each other, to being kind, to being thoughtful, to being good citizens of the world. Literature offers a space to explain and engage with the world as well as your place in it. So C.S. Lewis writes here, it adds to reality, it doesn't simply describe it, right? So this is not about reading something that's a snapshot of what's going on. It's about using that to inform our behaviors in the world, right? And then finally, fulfillment. I couldn't resist this. A literary scholar aims to be a holistic person versed in many facets of knowledge. We read, write, analyze, and discuss because we find pleasure and utility in these endeavors, right? And so if you're encountering a literature course, a humanities course more broadly, you will be gaining skills in sensitive reading, critical thinking, and persuasive writing. The field of literary studies in particular relies on the idea that narratives reflect various understandings of our world. These narratives can also inspire us to shape, constantly question, which is so important, and act on what we understand. So there's that sense of using what you learn, using those thoughts, and using them to putting those into action, doing something with them. Okay, so enough of that. Getting into the story. So this is Ian Forster. This throughout this slideshow, I have many different book covers. I think they're really kind of evocative. But Ian Forster was a British author. He wrote in many genres. He was a novelist, most famously, but also an essayist, speechwriter, short story writer, biographer. He published this story in 1909, which is kind of amazing because he basically predicted the internet, Alexa, Zoom, all of these things that we kind of use in our everyday lives. He wrote in the genre for this story of science fiction, and these are narratives that engage with how humans respond to scientific advancements, much like the series Black Mirror. If you've seen that, I'll talk about that a bit more at the end. This was considered one of the first stories in the subgenre of technological dystopian fiction, which later included Brave New World, if you've read that novel. Um, it concerns a world where humans live in an underground network of isolated pods and rely on the machine, this human created thing, for their needs, all of their needs, right? And it highlights the danger of disconnection from one another, importantly, and from the natural world, just as importantly. So let's dive into some of where that happens and how that happens. So if this were a normal classroom environment and we were studying this text, I would ask my students now, what does this world look like? Let's kind of paint this world together. What does it lack? And what is lacking that's meaningful about that lack? Where do we feel that, right? So some things, I'm not going to read through all of these quotes, but just to kind of prime you to think about using textual evidence to support any of the claims that you make, it lacks personal preference, right? Everything is uniform, everything is the same, everyone lives in the same kind of place. It's a place that lacks individuality and, very importantly, physical touch. This is something that should seem like horrifying to us, right? And I've got a quote kind of later at the end here, along with friendship, relationships, and familial bonds from when Vashti is looking up the duties of parents in the Book of the Machine. And the entry says, "Parents, duties of," said the Book of the Machine, "cease at the moment of birth." So this is kind of like a Handmaid's Tale situation where physical touch only happens for the sole reason of procreation, and then it's disgusting and it's over, right? And so parents do not nurture their children after this. That's not what this is about. So none of that, no personal or no physical touch. Friendships, there are connections that people make, but kind of like what you see sometimes in social media, what you see on, in networking platforms where they're superficial at best. The people don't actually know each other. They don't seem to be really connected, right? So that's missing. Joy, humor, purpose, guidance, personal growth, sense of like what you can be, what you can become. This is like the question for you right now, right? As you embark on college, as you're entering this new adventure in your lives. Okay, so more things that this world lacks. Oh, I had to include this still from WALL-E. If you've seen this film, it's a great Pixar film that felt to me like a nicer version of what's happening in this. So in this world, as you see, it's very sterile, right? Everyone's got their own personal screen. They can interact with each other, but they're kind of just in their own world, but they're tightly packed like sardines, right? It's very overstimulating. There's no natural light, no natural anything. It's just lights and buy this, welcome to economy, right? You can buy, it says in order, buy, shop, live, right? So that's a kind of order of priorities here. So check out WALL-E if you have any interest in that. It's quite amazing. But this world kind of reminded me of a bleaker version of what we see in WALL-E. Other things missing from this world, and then we'll get into the more natural parts, but a sense of freedom and directness, right? So you can't really move freely. Vashti, the mother in this text, was worried about direct experience. She likes secondhand things, third-hand things, right? There's this sense of preferring something recycled to something that's direct and real and right in front of you. Nuance. I will read this quote because I think this moment in the text is really devastating and does a lot to set up the whole world. So it says here, this is Kuno talking to his mother Vashti. He says, "In the airship." He broke off, and she fancied that he looked sad. She could not be sure, for the machine did not transmit nuances of expression. It only gave a general idea of people, an idea that was good enough for all practical purposes, Vashti thought. The imponderable bloom, declared by a discredited philosophy to be the actual essence of intercourse, was rightly ignored by the machine, just as the imponderable bloom of the grape was ignored by the manufacturers of artificial fruit. something good enough had long since been accepted by our race, right? So this sense of a world without nuance, that is not a world I want to live in. I think so much beauty and truth and reality lies in nuance and in the crevices of our lives, not what's transmissible when so much is lost, right? And also just artificial everything, right? This should be striking us early on in the story, as this is page 3, as something that's like deeply felt as missing, right? Other things missing, rebellion, right? This sense of kind of a creeping, slow takeover of something, some kind of entity, right? And then creativity, curiosity, and I think for Forster in part, most importantly, maybe alongside nature is critical thinking. So original thought is taken over by just ideas and the veneer of novelty. I will read this one too. Um, Beware of first-hand ideas. First-hand ideas do not really exist. They are but the physical impressions produced by love and fear. And on this gross foundation, who could erect a philosophy? Let your ideas be second-hand, and if possible, tenth-hand, for then they will be far removed from that disturbing element, direct observation, right? This is like ChatGPT. This is AI. This is what we're all really scared of, right? This recycling of ideas and nothing new coming from them, and this lack of air, really. So, okay, so beware, Forster is saying, of these worlds that lack critical thinking and new ideas, fresh perspectives. These things we get from reading, from humanities disciplines. Okay, so let's get into the specifically natural parts of this, the disconnection from nature and the natural world. So the first sentence of the story actually uses these natural terms. And at the very end as well, this metaphor is, he returns to this metaphor of the kind of beehive. So we get the first sentence, imagine if you can, a small room, hexagonal in shape, like the cell of a bee. So this society, which is these like packed pods, one next to another, right, kind of stacked up underground, is envisioned as like the cell of a bee. And that's interesting that he's using this natural language, this kind of biological metaphor to describe the architecture of this world. It's also interesting if you think of extending the metaphor to the hive mind mentality and thinking, unquestioning, or, unquestioning, not thinking, right? Um, and then later in the story, this is Kuno relaying his experience of going to the surface, which was terrifying to his mother. He says, out of the shaft, it is too horrible. A worm, a long white worm, had crawled out of the shaft and was gliding over the moonlit grass. I screamed. I did everything that I should not have done. I stamped upon the creature instead of flying from it, and it at once curled round the ankle. Then we fought. The worm let me run all over the dell, but edged up my leg as I ran. So here, just another use of kind of natural biological imagery to describe the mechanical elements of the machine, such as the configuration of the pods and the tubing of the mending apparatus as worm and creature. So I think he's trying to call our attention to the lack of nature in this world that's using these biological terms to describe these technological mechanized parts. So in other parts of the story, we get to moments where nature is discussed in terms of something that needs to be kind of conquered and taken over. And so we return to this quote from my first slide, the night and day, wind and storm. He had harnessed Leviathan. So I have emboldened words here and terminology that has to do with harnessing, defeat, conquering, exploitation, all of this language about, humans kind of being the predators of nature, which is their prey, and finally conquering this kind of beast that needs to be conquered. So he had harnessed Leviathan. Yet the attempt to defeat the sun aroused the last common interest that our race explained about the heavenly bodies, or indeed about anything. It was the last time that men were compacted by thinking of a power outside the world. The sun had conquered, yet it was the end of his spiritual dominion. Dawn, midday, twilight, the zodiacal path touched neither men's lives nor their hearts, and science retreated into the ground and to concentrate herself upon problems that she was certain of solving. How boring, how terrifying is a world where you only investigate things that you already know the answer to, right? So again, this language, harnessed, defeat, conquered, right? And then finally, this other quote toward the end of the story, but humanity in its desire for comfort had overreached itself. It had exploited the riches of nature too far. Quietly and complacently, it was sinking into decadence, and progress had come to mean the progress of the machine. So human progress, this sense of growth of, not even growth like economic growth, the personal growth of the soul is now only reflected as the growth of the machine, right? That's all that's important here because humanity had overexploited the riches of nature, right? So this is Forster warning us against that, not to do that. And indeed, we get quite the warning. So throughout the text, I'll just go to this part. This is basically two viewpoints, Vashti and Kuno, which may represent two different viewpoints of a generation. Vashti, the older generation, the parent, the mother, and Kuno, the younger son, who longs to reconnect with nature, who's thinking outside of the box, who's doing things that are outside of the norm for the society. So this moment where Vashti has been convinced by him to go see him one time, very reluctantly, right, before the airships are completely discontinued. This quote kind of shows her desire for the machine to distance her from nature, right? So here, I'll read this. At midday, she took a second glance at the earth. Wait, sorry, I can't see this. Hold on one sec. The airship was crossing another range of mountains, but she could see little owing to clouds. Masses of black rock hovered below her and merged indistinctly into gray. Their shapes were fantastic. One of them resembled a prostrate man. So this is the narrator talking, like shapes fantastic. These are mountains. This is what people like go to see to inspire them to write and to think and to like get outside of themselves, right? No ideas here, murmured Vashti, and hid the Caucasus behind a metal blind. And that detail of metal blind, I think, is really important here. In the evening, she looked again. They were crossing a golden sea in which lay many small islands and one peninsula. She repeated, no ideas here, and hid Greece behind a metal blind. Again, repetition of metal blind, right? So Vashti, disconnection from nature, it's giving her no 10th hand ideas, right? Whereas Kuno longs to reunite with nature. So I'll read this quote here. But to me, the little hills were living, and the turf that covered them was a skin. So again, here, this kind of biological terminology, under which their muscles rippled. And I felt that those hills had called with incalculable force to men in the past, and men that had loved them. Now they sleep, perhaps forever. They commune with humanity in dreams. Happy the man, happy the woman, who awakes the hills of Wessex, for though they sleep, they will never die. This nature, this thing we thought needed to be tamed, it exists without us and it will exist after us, hopefully, unless we really, really, really mess things up. And we're kind of on our way to doing that. But again, here we get Kuno kind of matching the language of the narrator. Their shapes were fantastic. One of them resembled a prostrate man of these mountains, right? Here, the hills were living, the turf that covered them was a kind of skin, right? The beauty, the likeness we have with nature and what it does for us, how it nurtures us. And then, okay, so moving on, this is maybe kind of the last moment where nature comes up in a really important way, and it's the last moment of the story. So bear with me. I'm going to read this part, and then I won't be reading much anymore. So, this is the very end of the story. Everything is breaking down. The machine, as the title suggested, is stopping, right? Everyone's about to die. So this is Kuno and Vashti finally having an interaction, a real interaction together. Kuno, or Vashti, she crawled over the bodies of the dead. His blood spurted over her hands. It's like kind of remarkable that I'm celebrating blood spurting out of someone's hand because it finally means some kind of human connection, some kind of real intimacy here. Quicker, he gasped. I am dying, but we touch, we talk, not through the machine. He kissed her. We have come back to our own. We die, but we have recaptured life. As it was in Wessex, when Elfred overthrew the Danes, we know what they know outside, they who dwelt in the cloud that is the color of a pearl. But Kuno, is it true? Are there still men on the surface of the earth? Is this tunnel, this poisoned darkness, really not the end? He replied, I have seen them, spoken to them, loved them. They are hiding in the mist and the ferns until our civilization stops. Today they are the homeless. Tomorrow, oh, tomorrow, some fool will start the machine again tomorrow. Never, said Kuno, never. Humanity has learned its lesson. As he spoke, the whole city was broken like a honeycomb. An airship had sailed in through the vomitory into a ruined wharf. It crashed downwards, exploding as it went, rending gallery after gallery with its wings of steel. For a moment they saw the nations of the dead, and, before they joined them, scraps of the untainted sky. So we're left with this taste of joy, this kernel of hope with these scraps of the untainted sky. And even though this civilization is over, everyone we've encountered is dying, there's a sense of hope because there are people who are connected to each other, who are connected to nature, that may restart this civilization and may not make these same mistakes. And so Forster here is saying, do you choose this world of connection, of curiosity, of rebellion, of love, of touch, of nature? Or do you choose this over reliance? Do you choose this ability to have things at your fingertips easily, given what it means, given what the consequences are? Which do you choose? Do you want sky at all? Do you want it to be untainted, right? So that's what Forrester is asking us to kind of ask ourselves. So I'll just zoom through the rest because I'm mindful of time here, but some takeaways. We mentioned the title, so the machine stops. What then? What happens when it stops? Where does that leave us? Where are we? What are we? Who are we? Right? Forster offers us here a narrative about loss, grief, and dehumanization because people have lost their literal and metaphorical roots, their sense of rootedness, right, to each other, to the earth. Forster articulates a link between removal from nature and a loss of humanity. The text urges readers to think critically about forces that come between humans and nature and to prevent this loss of connection to the earth that nurtures us. So in my discussion section, maybe in the Q&A, we can think about things that detach us from nature and forces in our lives that might not be as dramatic as this apocalypse, but might be more than we're comfortable with, right? And then I should definitely leave the philosophy to Professor Vickers, but this did really remarkably remind me of Plato's allegory of the cave, which is where, people are chained to a cave and they see these shadows and they think that's their reality, but they're unenlightened about what reality is actually out there. And so here in this case, the machine affords isolation, removal from the sun and the air, as well as direct experience. The information shared through the machine is all recycled shadows of reality, right? It's about inner and outer worlds, including the natural world. How do we avoid living in the shadows is what this is asking us, right? And my answer to that is a liberal arts education. So especially in the humanities, right? That will train you to think critically, save you from the shadows, and just a couple more things, and then I will be off. If you are interested in this genre, Parable of the Sower is an excellent text. It's an apocalyptic sci-fi text. There's a graphic novel version, but Octavia Butler started with the regular novel. It's excellent, all about nature and disconnect. It's literally about sowing seeds, right? And what that means. Black Mirror, a series all about our encounters with technology, often technology that detaches us from nature and what the consequences of that can be. And thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful time at USC. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you, Dr. Hasselbach. It always astounds me when you see something that's written 100 plus years ago, sometimes hundreds of years ago, sometimes over 1,000 years ago, and it feels so relevant. It feels like it's speaking to us in this very moment. So I really am. I know I always feel humbled by it because it makes me realize that humans have always been going through similar things, but we are perhaps in some ways in more extreme moments now than even those who wrote these things. Well, we're talking about stories today, and I'm sure that Dr. Sara will lead us in a really great discussion of another story that kind of speaks to us in this moment. Dr. Sara, please.
Thank you. Let me set my technology so I get that out of the way, and then I will greet everybody. Okay, how are we doing there? Can you see a slideshow? Okay, hurrah. So hello everyone. I'm so glad to be speaking today on our last panel. And I'm so excited to be part of this panel with Dr. Hasselbach and Dr. Vickers, both, colleagues and also friends. These, and not to embarrass either of my colleagues, but are just some of the most passionate people that I work with, not only about their subject matter, but also about their students. So just keep that in mind when you're looking for classes. These are both just excellent choices for you. So my name is Brittany Asaro. I'm part of the Italian Studies program in the Department of Languages, Cultures, and Literatures. I teach a lot of different types of courses there. I do teach Italian language. If any of you want to learn Italian while you are at USD, I would be happy to have you. And I teach a lot of courses, different kinds of courses on culture, Italian history, Italian literature. There's a lot of things that I could have chosen to talk about today when it comes to environment and action. Italy, for example, is the birthplace of many important global environmental initiatives. Some of you might be familiar, for example, with the slow food movement. There are many others. Um, I'm thinking about the first week, in fact, you learned about the poem by Francis of Assisi. This is really the first example that we have of literature being written in Italian, where Francis talks about nature. So we look at that as well. In my class, my fourth semester class, we look at women shepherds in Italy today, the great things that we're doing. So lots of things. What I chose at the end is a little bit different. I chose something from a work that we studied in a class on Italian children's fantasy. So I'm going to give you a taste of that today. The title of the book that we'll be talking about and that you read a little bit from is called Il Cerchio Magico, or The Magic Circle. It was written by Susanna Tamaro and published just over 20 years ago in 1994. But I think you'll see that when it comes to issues that we looked at already in Dr. Hasselbach's presentation, humans' destruction of the environment and our bondage to technology, the novel seems like it could have been written today, even though it's about 20 years old by now. Italian children's fantasy tends to stay close to the natural world. It's unique in that way. And in fact, there's a scholar named Lindsay Myers that has coined the term compensatory fantasy to describe Italian children's fantasy like The Magic Circle that has been published from 1980 onward. And they're compensatory, she says, because they focus on the extraordinary events that happen to normal human children, and the magic that takes place in these books always helps the protagonist to compensate for social, environmental, or personal shortcomings in their own life. So even though Tamaro's book has the word magic in the title, it has a lot to teach us about how we as humans can do and should interact with the natural world. And in fact, even though this is the story, as you can guess, of a human child who can talk to animals, the author herself doesn't consider it a fantasy. In a 2013 interview, Tamaro, who is in fact a contemporary Italian author, not known only or even primarily as a children's author, she's a major author of the 21st century. She describes what she does when she writes children's books. She says it's to see reality, but to tell it from another point of view, to distort reality, showing its magical, liberating potential. So, to understand this further, we might look at some facets of Tamaro's identity. One is that she has Asperger's syndrome, which often prevents her from expressing emotions in a way that is similar to other humans and makes connecting to other humans challenging. On the other hand, Tamaro has a deep love for animals, who she sees as possessing emotions as complex and at times more complex than humans. Tamaro's family, as she has described it, consists of the screenwriter Roberto De Falco, along with the many different animals that live on their farm in central Italy. So, if we think about Rick, who's the protagonist of The Magic Circle, and his interactions with his wolf mother and animal friends, for Tamaro, multi-species relationships are really not that fantastical or unrealistic, and even point to a great potential that humans and animals have to meaningfully connect with one another and live together to mutual benefit. So with this in mind, let's turn now to Il Cerchio Magico, the Magic Circle. Sorry, I'm between languages. This is what happens when you're multilingual. You'll find out if you study languages at USD. So here you have a few different editions of the novel whose covers give you some hints on what it's about. And I've also included an image of the Virgin in Portuguese, and this is because it has the subtitle How to Save Nature, which doesn't appear in the original Italian, but it's spot on. This is a children's novel, but it is surprisingly complex, so I'll just be offering you some highlights today, and I'm going to keep it light on the analysis and instead describe to you what I find to be the key points in the book, and we can discuss more during our group meetings. A quick disclaimer, Il Cerchio Magico has not been translated into English, so I'll be doing my best to translate today. In the first chapter, we learn about the origins of the protagonist Rick, a human child, and his mother Gwendy. Gwendy is a wolf dog, daughter of a wolf mother, Silvermoon, and a German shepherd father, Akira, from whom Gwendy inherits the ability to read human hearts. Gwendy finds Rick abandoned. We don't know what happened to his human parents, and Gwendy raises him as her own. The other animals affectionately call him cucciolo nudo, meaning naked pup or naked cub. In the second chapter, the one that you read for this seminar, and which is also called The Magic Circle, we find out more about the world in which Rick and Gwendy live. It is in fact a forest inside an urban park, which is pretty common in Italy's cities. The humans in the park are afraid of the forest, thinking it highly dangerous. The narrator reveals what really lives inside the forest: Gwendy and Rick, a chimpanzee named Ursula, and numerous squirrels, mallards, foxes, seagulls, hamsters, guinea pigs, and cats, some who were born there and some who took refuge there from the mistreatment of humans. So it's clear that the magic circle is a model for healthy relationships between the natural world and its human and non-human inhabitants. Rick is also interested in the human world, represented by the park, which he observes from the safety of the forest. At the same time, he fully identifies and is proud to be a wolf. Rick's closest friend is Ursula, or Ursula, however you want to pronounce that in Italian or English, a chimpanzee and the first inhabitant of the magic circle. One day, Ursula tells Rick how she came to live there. She was part of a human experiment put on a rocket and sent into space. But instead of exploding with the rocket as the scientists had planned, she pushed a button and was launched into space with an escape pod. There she hears the stars speak to her. Stars speak, she explains to Rick, like flowers and trees speak, and even stones when they want to. The stars told her a very secret secret, that once, as a star fell, someone wished to live in harmony with the world, and thus the magic circle was created. What I find particularly fascinating, and this is probably because I study language, is that language is key here. Ursula acknowledges that there are different ways of speaking and that all of nature expresses itself, just in ways different from humans. Language is also important within the magic circle. Ursula explains, the magic circle is a special place in which all creatures live peacefully and in harmony. There is no pain or sorrow. Anyone who lives inside has the gift of understanding all of the languages of the world. If we lived outside, for you I would just be a monkey, and for you and you would only be a naked cub. We would sit in front of each other without understanding anything. And when you don't understand each other, it is a very bad thing. Sooner or later, you begin to argue, and from arguing to tearing each other to pieces is a very small step. Ursula reveals one more secret to Rick, and that before, the magic circle would glow every evening as a beautiful ring of light. But now it does not glow as often. And Rick has a heartbreaking discovery that the magic circle is fading and will one day disappear. In the weeks after this discovery, Rick's sleep is fraught. We read, as soon as he closed his eyes in the den he shared with Gwendy, he began to toss and turn, whipping the leaves into the air, kicking and punching, talking to himself. One night he yelled so loud that even Gwendy woke up. You might have been noticing some of these wonderful illustrations by the English artist Tony Ross. And what I love most about these are the expressions on the characters' faces. Ursula's stupefied stare into the cosmos, or Rick's wide-eyed absorption of the mysteries of the Magic Circle's origin story. Ross also gives us a depiction of Gwendy discovering Rick when he wakes her up in the den. We get the mother's concern on her face as she helplessly watches her child confront the terror of the destruction of the natural world. And nowadays we might call this eco-anxiety. And in fact, the magic circle is destroyed in the next chapter by the corrupt mayor of the human city, Ulderico Triponzo, or Ulderic Three Stomachs. He runs a campaign with the slogan, No More Poop on Balconies, and gives a speech that parodies the delusional identification of humans as dominators of nature. For millennia, he tells a crowd, humans have been oppressed and persecuted by the arrogance of nature. Who among us has not had to endure the indignity of a mosquito bite? And how many lives have been ruined by pollen allergies? And what about birds? Aren't we fed up by being woken up every morning by their unworthy racket? Wouldn't you like a world without mice, without spiders, without flies or wasps, and without pigeons pooping on our balconies? Think about bats and reflect on whether it is right in the 21st century, when we humans are masters of the earth and the cosmos, those hideous and senseless creatures still roam among us to frighten us. Is it right, I ask, that because of them our nights are filled with terror? Humankind is the sole emperor of the world. Our intelligence is unmatched. Computers, cars, blenders, everything that exists is the fruit of our greatness. So isn't it time to transform the world in our image and likeness? Think of your dining rooms, your bathrooms. They are clean, shiny, disinfected. That's how we want the rest of the cosmos to be. So we soon learn that Three Stomachs has teamed up with what we could call a business ogre, Sua Molosa Porchezza Palaciccia il Primo, his royal squishy ball of fat the first, the owner of a chain of super mega hypermarts, and pretty obviously the personification of reckless overconsumption and groupthink. He also has a slogan, which is a television jingle, and I'll say it in Italian first because it rhymes. Un mondo pulito, obbediente, panza piena in testa niente, which means a clean and obedient world, belly full and nothing in the head. Ball of Fat also gives a speech. Every life has a dream, but what if every life wanted to realize their dream? It would be chaos, total anarchy. We want everyone to have one dream, the best one, ours. We will empty people's heads, make them as light as balloons, and when their heads are empty, their stomachs will want only one thing, to be full. Every natural area will be transformed into a super mega hypermart. The doors will be wide open from dawn to dusk. There will not be a single minute of the day when it will not be possible to buy something. There is a key to Ball of Fat's plan, which is also its weakness: children. Ball of Fat needs to brainwash kids to make his own consumer army, and he will do so by hypnotizing them with TV commercials. These kid zombies are a huge asset to him, but Ball of Fat is also aware of what would happen without technology. All it takes, he says, is a 10-minute blackout, 10 minutes without television for primal chaos to return to their little heads. They play hide and seek, they run, they jump, they climb trees, they pet dogs. To make a long story short, they no longer care about the super mega hypermarts. Naturally, this is natural, very natural. Their little brains are soft and shapeless, close to animal brains. That's why we who care about the supremacy of the human being, we who have been relentlessly fighting the arrogance of nature for years, will take care of them. Now, many of you may already be thinking about these issues in terms of today's technology and the impact of media, social media on everyone, and especially young people. And we'll return to this in a moment. But for now, notice the loss of contact with nature is going hand in hand with passivity and indifference. As part of the plan, Three Stomachs and a Ball of Fat bulldoze the magic circle to make room for the hypermart, destroying it. They also kill Gwendy and kidnap Rick, who, however, soon escapes and finds some allies. One is the cat Dodo, the self-proclaimed queen of the dumpsters. This character is interesting because she labels humans according to an animal's perspective, apriscatole, or can openers, since people are capable of opening cans of food. She also has a more affectionate term, due zampe, or two paws, which she uses to describe another important character that appears at this point, Amalia Cipolloni, or Amalia Big Onions, called Zia Chip or Aunt Chip. Aunt Chip is in fact the character that Tamaro, the author, personally identifies with the most, as we can see in this Facebook post from 2021. Sometimes, Tamato writes, thinking about my books, I wonder which character I identify with most. I have no doubt it's Amalia Cipolloni, the retired acrobat. Those who have read The Magic Circle know who I'm talking about. That is, the eccentric old lady who refuses to keep a television in her house and rescues animals abandoned in dumpsters. Because of her resistance against virtual conformity and groupthink, his squishy royal ball of fat the first, king of all the supermarkets, televisions, and the cementification of the country, tries hard to eliminate her. Since I wrote it in 1994 and could not have imagined what would happen with the media, I think I can say I wrote a fairly prophetic book. We can also see similarities in Aunt Chip's thinking and the author's own worldview. For example, Aunt Chip perceives the weakness in Ball of Fat's plan and shows a great respect for kids, saying, children see things that adults are no longer capable of seeing. They are dangerous, you see. It would take only one of them to destroy Ball of Fat's plans. Likewise, Tomato has stated in an interview, adults often behave very childishly, but children are never infantile, not at least in the way we understand it. Children are extremely serious. They are close to the ways of the heart. So, speaking of Ball of Fat's plan, let's look at the final phase now. Near the end of the book, Ball of Fat makes another speech at his castle in which he outlines how he plans to achieve world domination by blowing up Aunt Chip, who, as we have seen, represents independent thinking and a resistance to technology. His method is elephant flatulence. Nature is our teacher and our source of inspiration, he says. Only nature, in her wickedness, could invent gases so powerful that the species she herself produced became extinct. That is why I say, nature has offered us the solution. By now it will be clear to you why I raise elephants in the stables next door, and why every day trucks overflowing with beans arrive at the castle. Elephants and beans are our ultimate solution. The best gut fermentation scholars, the best engineers have been working out this plan for years. When the fateful hour strikes, the elephants will be hoisted onto a huge trampoline. From there, a mechanical arm will push them down, and at the very instant that they touch down, boom, boom, mega boom, the accumulated gases from the beans will come out, and a pipe will feed the gas into Amalia Cipolloni's house. The gases will cover the lawn, the trees, and ta-da, in less than a second, all hostile life will cease to exist. So you may have been noticing there's a lot of scatological or potty humor in this book, and of course it's a kid's book, so if you spend a lot of time around kids or like me are in touch with your inner child, you know that this is universal kid humor. But it is also humor that is very close to the natural world, and Tomato is elevating it here to something literary, something that's part of a bigger message. So what happens next? Ursula reappears and cuts the power, turning off the TVs and freeing the children from the brainwashing. Rick, with the help of Ursula, Aunt Chip, and Dodo, diverts the pipe, and Ball of Fat and Three Stomachs themselves get blown up by the gas. Rick faints and wakes up to see Joyful Villa, the park where the magic circle once was. There's a crowd of people working together to break up the concrete of the super mega hypermart, and all around them, people are planting trees and flowers. In the book's last scene, Aunt Chip, Dodo, and Ursula enjoy an evening at the park where animals and people of all ages are now enjoying life together. Suddenly, Rick sees a falling star. He makes a wish and knows that the magic circle will one day be reborn. As he watches the star's light fade into the sky, Rick realizes that what Ursula had always said was true, and this is the idea with which the book ends. The world is round. It is a circle, a wheel. Everything goes and comes back. Everything ends to begin again. So, what lessons and warnings and solutions does the magic circle offer us? I think a lot, and I warned you that there's a lot going on in this little book that is only seemingly simple, right? We see the interconnectedness and circularity of life, of nature, but we're also aware that we can't depend on second chances. If we humans destroy the world, we won't be able to wish upon a star to get it back. But I think what Tomato is emphasizing here is hope, and specifically the hope in what can be achieved through cross-generational cooperation that values the life of all species. Though the magic circle is written for kids, Tomato's vision for a better world in this book includes everyone with a childlike heart, which for Tomato is synonymous with free thinking and a genuine love for the natural world. It takes the cooperation of Rick and Aunt Chip, representing two ends of the spectrum of human generations, to overturn the abuse of the natural world for consumerist ends. To this point, I appreciate the words of Lindsay Myers, who writes that by transporting their protagonists from primary worlds defined by materialism and atheism to secondary worlds predicated on love, selflessness, and spirituality, Tomato and other authors of compensatory fantasies all encourage their readers to look critically at the modern world, to speak out about injustice and inequality, and to question commercial values and aspirations, and to resist the desire to conform. So, taking the magic circle as inspiration, when I think about environmental action, I think a lot depends on our genuine commitment to future generations of life. And I would argue that this is completely independent from whether you as an individual make the choice whether or not to have kids. Tomato, along with her alter ego, Aunt Chip, which you can see here, is a really good example of someone who is not a parent and yet feels a sense of responsibility to future generations as part of a global community, and that includes both human and non-human life forms. Caring for the environment, in other words, calls us to care about what happens to the earth and its inhabitants even after our lifetimes. And we all can and must be part of that effort. So I'm going to leave you today with a quote from Tamaro about taking action for the future. She says, often the world of childhood is not considered something worthy of really spending energy on. We forget that the kids of today, the children of today, are the society of tomorrow, and therefore all of our best energies should be devoted to them. That is why I read children's books, because I think that everyone, as she or he is able, must bring a small stone to build the dialogue of growth, of understanding. So that's what I have for you today, and I really look forward to talking about this more in depth during our discussion group.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asaro. And I think it's a real shame that this book has not been translated into English. I would love for my son to read it, so I guess I'll have to learn Italian
It's on my
or
to-do
perhaps
list. Don't
Portuguese.
worry. Translation is on my to-do list.
Absolutely, that would be wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And now we have our final speaker. Dr. Vickers is going to tell us one last story, and then we're going to have a great discussion.
Sorry, everyone. I am having some internet problems. So hopefully we will be able to make this all work. All right, so hi everyone. I'm going to be talking about the Atlantis myth as a cautionary tale for environmental collapse. And I'm really excited to be here. My apologies for the technical difficulties. I'm particularly excited to be presenting alongside my two colleagues who have such interesting perspectives always on literature and whom I'm very excited to share the stage with today. I hope you really enjoyed their presentations and I'm sure you have a lot to talk about already, and I'll try to add in a few things as well. So what I wanted to start with was actually this poll about Atlantis, and I want you to do this in a Google form. I unfortunately did not grab the Google form link, so you can type it in there. For now. So I wanted to ask you, had you heard of the Atlantis myth before you took this class? I think most people have, but I'm just curious. Did you know that it started with Plato? Because oftentimes people have no idea where the Atlantis myth comes from. They have sort of a Saturday morning cartoon kind of vision of Atlantis with, people underneath the sea with all these electronic devices and things. And then, did you believe that Atlantis was a real place prior to the class? Explain. This actually is because I have heard from an archaeology professor that he asks his students about whether or not they believe in Atlantis every semester. And he does this really sort of interesting chart of a bunch of their beliefs about archaeology. And then, do you currently believe that Atlantis is a real place? There are a number of different hypotheses. Do you buy into one of those? Or do you think it's something that Plato used as fiction to try to make a point? As you're filling that out, I have that still linked on the side. I just wanted to introduce myself. So I am Dr. Darby Vickers, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, so I have a slightly different perspective than the literature people that you have heard speak already. I'm also the element chair for the technology and humanities element at the Humanities Center. And we're actually going to be having our first event on October 8th. We're going to have an archaeologist come in and talk about the ways that archaeologists are learning about things like climate by using the kind of large scale data and AI models to try to understand the climate of the past, and then can also project this into the future to look at things like whether or not a particular archaeological monument that has been left is going to end up eroding away because of weather patterns and things like that. So some really interesting use of artificial intelligence for preserving the natural world, and he'll be talking about that. So my research interests are ancient philosophy, ethics, epistemology, which is the study of things like belief and knowledge, and ethics of technology, particularly ethics of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I have been a part of these particular first at USD lectures over the last few years, mostly talking about Plato and artificial intelligence. But I'm really excited to be talking about the Atlantis myth today, which is a lot of fun. I wanted to sort of ask this question because we often think about environmental action as a kind of new phenomenon, as particularly an awakening that humanity had after the Industrial Revolution. And oftentimes, environmental destruction is depicted in the way that you saw in the other two readings that you had for today, which is things like machines or massive technologies that are really displacing the sort of traditional natural world that we as humans live in. Um, and I think what's really interesting is you don't have to go in that sort of sci-fi or machine-based direction to see these cautionary tales about environmental collapse and what happens if we're destroying the natural world. In fact, there's all sorts of destruction that can happen that doesn't have to have this sort of extreme technology. And in fact, in the ancient world, in both among the Greeks and among the Romans, there was real sort of horror at the kind of environmental destructions that mining would provide. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about one possibility of this idea of environmental destruction in Atlantis was Plato observing the silver mines in Athens. And I am going to do this in sort of like three parts. So I want you thinking both about like understanding the content of the Atlantis myth. So I'll talk a little bit about the text and we'll read some text together and take a look at it. Then I want to sort of model how you can extract theory from a non-straightforward text, right? So Plato famously writes dialogues. You got an opportunity to see that, that there's a sort of dialogue format to the Timaeus and the Critias. Also, this is a very strange story and it's told in a rather odd way, and we have this dramatic setting. And so I want you to sort of understand what it looks like to try to extract an argument from a non-traditional text like that. Um, and this sort of idea that stories can contain arguments that we can use and think about in the world outside. And then I'm going to use this as a demonstration that old philosophical texts can provide insight for answering today's burning questions. So even though this text was written 2,500 years ago, I think that both this and a lot of the sort of like older texts that you might encounter in your various classes can provide some wonderful insights for today. So I'm still having trouble getting my slides to go forward. So the basics of the Atlantis myth. So the frame of the myth is that Solon heard a story from a priest at Sais, which is a place in Egypt. We have records. So Solon was a historical figure. He was a leader of Athens. He famously solved a lot of problems by creating a law code. And then he left because he got the Athenians to agree that they would use his laws for 10 years. And that only he could change them in that 10-year span. And then he left Athens so that nobody could bother him and try to get him to change the laws. And we know that he went a bunch of places, including Egypt, where he could have potentially heard this story. In the story, right, Solon is a relative of Critias, who also is a relative of Plato's. So Solon was a relative of Plato's. And you can imagine that there's a possibility that Plato heard this story that had been passed through his family. The story is set 9,000 years ago, and there are these two impressive societies with significant naval power, so Athens and Atlantis, that fight each other, and both of those two societies are destroyed. We see that Athens will rise again because, of course, this conversation is happening in Athens among a bunch of present-day Athenians, but Atlantis vanishes under the sea and disappears forever, according to the story. And then Critias, who is telling the story, insists that the story is true and provides many strange details about Atlantis. I had you read some of those lists of details, but not all of them, because they are a sort of massive amount of text with a lot of mind-boggling numbers. And there's some interesting controversy about the existence of Atlantis in the ancient world, although there's less controversy than I thought when I initially started looking into this. So one of the really interesting things about doing research on this particular part of Plato, and the reason that I had you read the actual primary text, or one of the reasons, is that the second that you search for anything that has to do with Atlantis, you get a whole bunch of conspiracy theories and people pretending to be academics. So I actually had a really interesting experience going down a rabbit hole and trying to find this quotation. Because there's this sort of story, you hear it in introductions to these two dialogues. You'll hear it all over the place that Aristotle says that the person who created Atlantis also destroyed it and said that Atlantis was not a real place. It turns out Aristotle, we have no record of Aristotle saying this, which is totally wild because I was looking for an attribution to this quote. And I had to use a lot of my sort of like liberal arts education, critical thinking skills, information literacy to try to find this out and to go actually look at some of the sort of texts in which this is alleged that Aristotle said this. And it turns out that the closest thing that we can find to an attribution of this quote is that it's a possible interpretation of a quote from a geographer who's a Roman geographer named Strabo. And it actually is a conflation between two different pieces of text. And this is not the obvious interpretation. So it's really interesting that this story exists. And it's worth actually chasing things like this down and trying to get the skills to be able to do that. And that's part of what some of your classes will be at USD. You have a critical theory flag, or sorry, a critical thinking flag and an information literacy flag that are on some of the classes that you'll have to take for the core. I wanted to take a quick look at the testimony of the priests of Sais, and particularly these sections that I've highlighted in orange. So they say there have been and there will continue to be numerous disasters that have destroyed human life in many kinds of ways. The most serious of these involve fire and water, while lesser ones have numerous other causes. Wherever the gods send floods of water upon the earth to purge it, herdsmen and shepherds in the mountains preserve their lives, while those who live in cities in your region are swept by the rivers into the sea. And then I'm going to skip down to the next orange bit. In your case, on the other hand, as in that of others, no sooner have you achieved literacy and all the other resources that cities require than that there, after the usual number of years, comes a heavenly flood. It sweeps upon you like a plague and leaves you illiterate and uncultured people behind. You become infants all over again, as it were, completely unfamiliar with anything that there was in ancient times, whether here or in your own region. And so this is a really interesting piece of testimony that we have from the priest at Sais. And the Egyptian priest essentially in this passage is claiming that Greece has forgotten its history while Egypt retains these written records. And in fact, we do actually have written records of many things from Egypt. We don't have anything that looks like this, but this is sort of a real sort of historical fact that Egypt had these long-standing records, while there were indeed periods of illiteracy in Greece's history. And in particular, while many details of this story are false, this introduction in particular describes some real events that actually happened, although the years are a little bit off. I mean, more than a little bit off. In particular, some interesting things that we have to think about that might be sort of true aspects of this story. So certainly there are flood myths all over the world. Cultures had flood myths. So of course, Noah's Ark, the Greek flood myth, is Deucalion and Pyrrha, but even like Native Americans have great flood legends that show up in Native American culture. And there's a sort of question about whether or not this is memory of a particular period in human history in which there were great floods that wiped out everything that people knew, or whether there's some kind of just convergence between cultures because of individual floods that these individual cultures have had. So there's a sort of like possibility of some true source to these kind of flood myths that may have happened in the human past. There's also something really interesting here because we have a couple of specific periods of time where we know that there was systemic collapse in Greece, and Plato seems to be relating something that looks very much like things that we have archaeological records for. So for example, the end of Minoan civilization, which was the first large-scale civilization that we have evidence of in Greece. They had absolutely beautiful paintings. If any of you have played Assassin's Creed Odyssey, there's a wonderful scene where you get to go in and see some old Minoan palaces that are left on one of the islands. It's an absolutely beautiful reconstruction, and it was totally worth me convincing a friend to play the game on my behalf because I am not good enough at video games to be able to actually succeed. So I got to tour around the Greek world, which was really fun. Highly suggest it. And Minoan civilization was ended, as far as we can tell, by the Thera explosion. So on what is now the island of Santorini, there was a gigantic volcano. There still is a volcano there. It's been dormant for a long time, and it exploded and actually totally changed the shape of the island. And presumably the Thera explosion would have been large enough that it would cause extreme changes in climate and the environment and all of these things. And a number of Minoan sort of centers seem to have collapsed. And then a few of them come back later, but we see something like language and cultural change because they have been invaded by the next civilization, which is the Mycenaeans, who are the early Greek speakers. Um, and then also we have sort of things happening that are similar and spell the end of human civilization with the end of the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean. So there's what's called systems collapse, which means that everything, all of the trade networks, all of the sort of various aspects to society collapse all at once. There seems to be civil disruption. There is burning, all of these things. So we know that there's some kind of systems collapse in the Mediterranean around, I think it's 1177 BC is the typical date that people use. And this is where we get all of the Trojan War myths. Troy was one of the cities that was destroyed in this collapse. And then we also hear from the Egyptians that there was this group that they call the Sea Peoples, who appear to be this kind of motley crew of people potentially from a set of islands in the Aegean that would come around and would destroy various civilizations. So we know that that also is a period of destruction. And then we also have sort of following the Bronze Age, this Iron Age, right? So people have changed the kind of metals that they're using because bronze requires tin, and you can't get tin in Greece. You have to get it from either Afghanistan or England, and the trade networks had collapsed, so that was no longer possible. And there's a switch over to iron as the primary metal. We see a significant population decrease from the archaeology and from the number of graves that we have. There's a disappearance of writing. So just as Plato said that the people fall into illiteracy, we see the disappearance of writing from the archaeological record. And there is, in fact, an archaeological evidence of a herding culture in the mountains that is the primary way that people are sticking around. So you get this really interesting depiction of potentially one or some sort of mixture of both of these types of collapse that happen during these periods. Some obviously false things that show up in this testimony are there's no advanced civilization in the Mediterranean 9,000 years before Plato, and our closest evidence is temples on Malta from about 2,000 years later. So there are a lot of really interesting questions about whether or not this 9,000 years was just supposed to be like a really long time, or what exactly this might mean. And then we know that also Atlantis was supposed to be set outside the Pillars of Heracles, and there's no evidence of a civilization of this side outside of the Pillars, which is presumably at Gibraltar. There's also no evidence for the non-navigable mud shoals outside of the Pillars that are described in the Timaeus in the section that you read. So there are some interesting things that are clearly made up by Plato. But although we do get a bunch of geographers assuming that Plato was right about this in the Timaeus, and we actually have a lot of testimony of this sort of mud flat that does not seem to have actually been there. And then the massive size of Atlantis is also something that is probably not correct, and we can't have a sort of true source for that. But there's something really interesting that happens as well, which is during Plato's lifetime, there was a city called Helike, and which was a potential model for Plato's Atlantis. It was a Greek city that disappeared in a single night. It was built on an area that was prone to earthquakes, and an earthquake ends up causing a tsunami. And the city was visible underneath the waters for hundreds of years after that, and Romans would actually sail over it and look at the city below. So really interesting model for looking at the ways in which a civilization might collapse that Plato may have drawn upon. But you might be wondering at this point, because I've talked a bunch about history and about how we can extract truth from text, but I haven't sort of talked much about environmental crisis specifically. So I wanted to do that by talking about the Athenian silver mines. So the Athenian silver mines were the backbone of Athenian naval power because they were owned by the sort of like area called Attica, which was contained the city of Athens, and uh, it was where a lot of the wealth of Athens came from. So if you've ever been to Greece and you've been to Athens and you've seen the Parthenon, and you've seen all the sort of beautiful temples and classical era things around there, all of that was built, or much of that was built off of this particular silver that was extracted when the Athenians found a silver mine during the Persian Wars. And so Athens ended up becoming the dominant power in the Mediterranean during the Persian Wars because they were able to use all this wealth to build these warships. And this silver allowed Greece to defeat the Persian invaders and funded Athens's classical flowering and all of the incredible buildings that you see today. And I just wanted to give you a picture of what this looks like. So this is a 3D reconstruction, or I mean, it's a 2D picture of what was supposed to be a 3D reconstruction of the Athenian Acropolis. And you can see, right, there's this like gigantic gold statue here. You have all of these wonderful buildings that sadly are not in this kind of shape today. But you can sort of like see what it looks like, and you can see that it's on this sort of piece of rock that is, of course, also something that shows up in Plato's story of Atlantis. And in particular, the silver mines cut into the landscape. There were sort of horrifying conditions in the silver mines. They were worked by tens of thousands of slaves who were not treated well, and it was essentially a death sentence to become a slave in the silver mines. Um, and all of the trees for miles around were cut down for fuel to work the various pieces of machinery that were in the mine, and the land was devastated. The archaeologist John Hales describes it as looking at like Mordor from Lord of the Rings, which is also a story about the sort of like problems of technology, right? And so it's this sort of like barren landscape full of like this coughing black smoke and all of these kinds of things. And so it's really interesting to see that Plato, looking at something like that, might have said, oh, wow, you know, things like deforestation and our attempt to just sort of like have a civilization flower overnight is very similar to the kind of hubris that the Atlanteans show. And they're punished for their sort of crimes in this way by Poseidon bringing a gigantic wave that is going to wipe out the civilization, but also wipes out the particular group that they were fighting. So we might see Atlantis as a cautionary tale to remind the Athenians to be better stewards of the environment and to think more carefully about the kinds of destruction that they might bring onto the landscape if they try to expand their power too quickly and too greedily. And what I wanted to do now, all right, so just for fun, to let us think about this, I am going to share the responses here. So the vast majority of you had heard of the Atlantis myth before you took the class. Most people did not know that it started with Plato. I didn't know that either for many years. Most people did not believe in the Atlantis myth, although we get a couple who did, or like society that inspired the story. And then, do you currently believe that it's a place or a name for a real place? So interesting. A bunch of you ended up changing your minds about this in part potentially because of some of the true things that we can see in Plato's story. Okay. Um, so we looked at your responses, which was really interesting, and you can see some of the things that you extracted from Plato. And then I am happy to chat about any of these things. Hopefully, you enjoyed learning a little bit about the Atlantis myth and some of the environmental destruction that happened many years ago.
Thank you so much. And I think that's really a perfect way to end this whole discussion over the course of the last few weeks, because in a way we're coming full circle. We're basically have we gone all the way back in order to come all the way forward. And we started already had a really great question to start our discussion. So I want to continue along those lines. I think that was the question is basically how do we get people to heed these warnings? You know, if you have warnings basically going back thousands of years, warnings going back maybe 100+ years, and more recent warnings. And there are many, many more examples of them, including the absolute explosion in apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic movies, television shows, books. It seems like many of the most watched shows these days are apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic. So it seems like we know something. You know, I think that has to be a reflection of what we're worried about, what we're thinking about, what we're interested in. But I want to come back to that question. I think it was a really good question. How does that translate into people actually wanting to do something? One last question, or should we call it call it a whole summer, in fact? All right, I will let everyone off the hook. Thank you to our three wonderful presenters. This is fascinating. Like I said, I think the perfect way to end things because we are storytellers when it comes down to it. And so understanding all of the things we've been talking about throughout these last weeks through story, I think is an important way to tie it all together. I want to thank all of you students for being here, for taking this so seriously, for all the work you've done, both in preparation, but also in your small group meetings. And please, we have one more week. Please do, one more great job in your small group meetings. And I want to welcome you to USD. You're going to be on campus very soon. I'm so excited about that. I think I can speak for all the professors who've taken part in this. If you need anything at all, please come see us, reach out to us, email us, whatever it is. If you want to talk about any of these things in greater detail, it's our greatest joy to talk with students, especially in cases where they don't have to talk to us about things. If you come to a professor, and this is my one big piece of advice for you, don't be the person who's there in office hours every time because that might be a bit much. But although I wouldn't mind it. But be somebody who your professors know. If only, again, this might come down to the rational versus the just appreciation. Rationally, it's a good idea for you because if your professors know you and you are engaged, they're going to think highly of you. But more from a perspective of enjoying your college experience, try to just be part of things in every way. So engage with others, engage with your professors, come to office hours, talk about this, soak up every last minute of it because it is a special time and it's a time where you can just luxuriate in thinking and learning lots of really interesting things. But if you need anything at all, please reach out to us and we look forward to seeing you on campus very soon.